Hey church, good to see you here. We've been talking over the last 5 weeks about being a blessing. And Jesus talks about this in Luke chapter 14. If you want to be my disciple, it is going to cost you. Take up your cross and follow me. We've been talking about being a blessing, and we've been laying out simple ways that you can do this. But in this simplicity, there is also a cost. And since the death of Christ until now, his followers have always had to bear the cost. A servant, Jesus said, is not greater than his master. And because our master suffered and there was a cost for his walk, we should assume the same thing. Back in AD 64, the Emperor Nero wanted to rebuild a section of Rome. So he set the homes and the buildings on fire. The fire was so great that it burned for 6 days. And at the end of this, people were starting to blame Nero for this. But Nero, in order to save himself, started accusing the Christians of starting the fire. And in doing so, he unleashed a terrible wave of state-sponsored persecution against the church. Christians were arrested, some were crucified, while others were tied to poles and lit on fire. But even the Apostle Paul and Peter were swept up in these persecutions. But this didn't stop them being a blessing to the people around them. In fact, the witness of the early church was so tied to their persecution that the Greek word for witness, martys, became synonymous for the word martyr. But that didn't stop these ambassadors for Christ of blessing those around him. They continued on, beginning with prayer, listening, eating, and experiencing together, serving, and then also sharing the story of Christ. They faithfully proclaimed his message and what he had done for them. And the gospel went throughout the world, even though persecution was a part of this. Now, some will hear and respond to the gospel well, and others will say no. But be encouraged. There will be those who recognize the voice of God in this, and we continue to be faithful to this. And so we need to ask ourselves the question, what price are we willing to pay so that the gospel will be proclaimed here in our city, in southern Alberta, in the area where God has called us to be a blessing? The call is a way of life. It's something that everyone can do. And I want, honestly, all of us to be engaged in this, saying we can do this. I can pray, listen, experience, serve, and share the story with others. But we also need to be willing to bear the cost of this. And so I encourage you, my friends, to take up your cross and follow after Jesus in this, and you will be a blessing, and he will bless you. We're going to hear from my friend Chelsea now about how she shares the story of Jesus.
So Chelsea, this week we wrapped up our Blessed series by talking about sharing our story and how Jesus is a part of our story. So where do you find opportunities to share your story of how God has impacted your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, there's been various opportunities throughout my life, but primarily just in conversations with people. Just sitting down like this, it's a great time to, one, listen to someone and hear their story, and that's often for me the best opportunity actually is when you're sitting and someone's willing to share their own pieces of their story. It's a huge open door to say, hey, actually, I understand that, and to use those opportunities to even share how God has impacted me, maybe in a similar way or in differences that we can open up kind of the pieces that God is using in our own stories.
So how do you know when it's the right time to share that story?
Now that's a great question. I think for many people, that's like the Christian question of like, well, how do I know it's time to share? And I don't know that there's a right and wrong answer, but for me, primarily through listening and through prayer and through really intentional conversation to know, hey, we have the trust that I can share and I'm not just forcing some kind of conversation that you're going to be uncomfortable with. but to also listen and pray and to trust that the Holy Spirit's leading. If I'm in a conversation and I just feel that prompting of you need to share this piece, and it might be uncomfortable, right? Knowing that it's time doesn't mean I'm really comfortable and ready to share my story, but it's that prompting of the Holy Spirit saying, I think you need to be vulnerable in this moment. You need to share that piece. And so prayer and listening is a big piece to the people and to God, and just to know that He's leading in that time and that He's going to use that time as well.
So what kind of responses have you received?
Yeah, I think for me, there's been a various amount of responses. The best responses have been ones that have just happened over time, where I've been able to share pieces of my story that has just initiated questions. I think our story is a great way to just open the conversation for people to ask questions and to dig in a little bit deeper.
So how would you encourage somebody who's nervous about sharing their own story of how God has worked in their life?
I think this is a great question. As someone who's grown up in the church, I remember, and I probably still get nervous about sharing my own story, but I don't think that it's a task that we are set out to do. I think it's a representation of who we are. When we share our own stories, it's not I'm out to go do something, but it's actually, this is who I am, this is who God has been in my life. And I think Christianity is more about who we are. And so when we share who we are with others, it comes from our story. For me, growing up in a Christian home, I spent a lot of my life not thinking I had a story. And I think many Christians kind of, I don't really have a story. Which, if you've been a Christian for a week or 40 years, if you've been you have a testimony of the work that God has done in your life. And so I think no matter where you are in your faith walk, no matter what your job is, if you work in an office, if you work at a school, like wherever your life is, you have opportunities to share the work that God is doing in your life. And I think those are the keys that open up the gospel for other people.